From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Here's what's ahead. K-State's Sarah Lancaster will discuss spring herbicide treatments on wheat as it emerges from dormancy and starts to develop. She advises you producers to pay attention to the growth stage of wheat when choosing herbicides, and she'll break down the product options based on wheat plant growth. Also today from the IGP Institute here at K-State, Guy Allen provides his monthly update on the international grain trade scene, which right now is firmly affixed on the war in Ukraine and the resulting impacts on grain trade, particularly with respect to wheat. And later on this week's horticulture segment, K-State's Ward Upham is back to conclude his two-part look at planting garden potatoes. All that here on Agriculture Today. Thanks for tuning in. You're listening to Agriculture Today. We'll pick up first on today's broadcast on the winter wheat crop and springtime management. And this is into weed control for that crop as it breaks out of dormancy. We'll talk about watching the growth stages of that wheat and making herbicide decisions accordingly now with Sarah Lancaster, Weed Management Specialist, K-State Research and Extension. She just authored an article on this topic in the most recent Agronomy E-Update newsletter. Growth stage of the wheat. This is not just a nominal thing. It's pretty critical to weed control and the state of the crop itself, Sarah.
Right, Eric. So one of the things about weed control in wheat, well, in all crops really, is that there are certain phases of the life cycle where the crop is going to be more susceptible to injury from a herbicide application than in other phases of the life cycle. And we really see that as we move through the spring with our wheat crop. We have cutoffs both on the front end in terms of the wheat has to be big enough, but then we also have some cutoffs to watch on the back end before the wheat gets too mature. So, we got to kind of hit the sweet spot and also keep in mind the weeds, right? We want weeds that are small and actively growing. And so we've kind of had a tough time getting that actively growing piece here right. This fall and early spring.
Have to watch that as we go along here. But this is all captured in the labeling of the products themselves, right?
That's right, Eric. I know that herbicide labels are less than exciting reading material, but man, pretty much if you have a question about how to use that product, it's probably in that label. Now, it may be buried and difficult to find or interpret in a few cases, and so that's where you make a phone call to a county agent or to a retailer or whomever to get kind of some clarification on that. But most of the questions we have, especially about things like application timing, can be answered by a review of that herbicide label.
As a further table setter here, Sarah, if one is off their timing with their herbicide applications as the wheat continues to come along, continues to develop, what are the consequences? What do we actually see in the way of potential damage?
Yeah, so the impact that's going to probably affect the farmers the most, Eric, is going to be potential damage to that developing head. So if a farmer applies these products too late, especially some of the plant growth regulating herbicides like 2,4-D, we can see really malformed or misshapen heads that are just not going to yield like we need them to. The other thing that is important to think about, and we don't talk about quite as often, is the fact that sometimes these application timings are set based on how long it takes the plant to metabolize the herbicide so that we can keep the herbicide residues in that crop below the limits that are established by the USDA for safety in our food supply. So a couple of things going on there to impact the determination of those back-end application restrictions.
Well, that underscores the importance of what we'll talk about today in as far as being precise with your application timing here. And we'll walk through what's permitted in as far as applications at the various stages, starting with ahead of the wheat crop jointing. What products are approved for that kind of treatment?
So prior to jointing, one of the products that producers can consider is dicamba, which is a good product on a variety of broadleaf weeds, mustard species excluded. So dicamba could be an option. And also, if you're using herbicide-resistant wheat varieties, both the Clearfield and the coaxium herbicides should be applied prior to jointing.
But those aren't the only herbicides that must be on before jointing, correct?
Those would be the main ones. There are also some other ALS-inhibiting herbicides that need to be applied prior to jointing. Some of these would be the products that we use to go after some of our grasses, our brome grasses and things of that nature. So things like maybe Olympus, Powerflex, Rave would be options there or examples there.
Again, all of these prior to that jointing of the plant. There are others with a little more latitude. They can be applied right up to and through the boot stage of development.
Right. So some of our, honestly, more commonly used herbicides in wheat are going to fall into this category. Things like our Glean and Finesse, Ally and 2,4-D would fall in this category as well. And we should probably take a minute to talk about 2,4-D because it's really important that we don't go too early with 2,4-D applications. So I know I've been kind of watching some of my wheat, wanting to make sure that I'm going to get these post-application timings correct. Because if you apply wheat before it's tillering well, you're going to inhibit tiller production on that wheat crop. And you can visit with Romulo about the importance of those tillers for maximizing yield in your wheat crop.
You want to be careful with 2,4-D is your point, that you can do damage, actually.
Yeah, that's right. And so, an alternative to that might be MCPA. That could be applied anytime after the 3-leaf stage through the boot stage. Other things to think about with these 2,4-D and MCPA is the type of formulation, right? So we tend to think about ester formulations as being more effective on a lot of weed species relative to amine formulations, but we need to be a little bit cautious with those ester formulations about off-target movement. They're much more sensitive to volatility and movement off-target. So just a reminder to be a good neighbor and be aware of what's going on around you if you do choose to spray those ester formulations.
Keep that vapor drift to an absolute minimum.
That's right. That's right. Some things we like to share, but not herbicides that way.
You bet. And then those products that can be applied right through the flag leaf stage.
Yeah, so one that I'd like to point out is a newer product called Pixaro. If we have folks that are struggling a little bit with horseweed control, maybe they've got ALS-resistant horseweed in their fields, this could be a good alternative. It is a Group 4 herbicide, much like 2,4-D, dicamba, starine, things of that nature, but it's called Pixaro. And it's pretty effective on some of our broadleaf wheats that we can encounter in wheat.
But it's a new entry, but not the only one that one can look at here.
That's correct. Other things that we might look at in this later application category would be things like Culex, which is another newer product. Harmony, Ally, Wide Match also fall into this category, as well as some others. But, like we said at the top, Eric, just reading that label and really kind of making sure that you are following the label instructions is super important. Some of them will have some nuance to how they phrase the different growth stages on the label.
Really, Sarah, when you think about this in the big context, it's a delicate balance here because you're trying to adhere to these restrictions as far as when these can be safely applied. By the same token, aligning your treatments with whatever weed growth is out there. Dry conditions may be complicating that even further, might they not?
It can, and even in a more, quote, regular year where we have adequate moisture. So thinking about mustard species in particular, right? 2,4-D is a pretty effective and inexpensive product for a lot of our mustard species that we encounter in wheat. We want to spray those when they're rosettes yet, before they bolt, right? And so that's going to be this time of year. The problem is some of those mustard species are going to mature more quickly than others. Right? And so making sure, like you said, that you've balanced the growth stage and the activity of the weeds in your field with the growth staging of that wheat. My friendly reminder to put footprints in your field because scouting is so critical for good weed management.
And the time is now, if you haven't been out there for a while, to start walking, taking a look at what's going on. And, of course, the Chemical Weed Control Guide out of K-State, the 2022 edition, is out, has been for some time. one can reference this information in full detail in that guide.
Absolutely. You know, one of the pieces of that chemical weed control guide, Eric, is the herbicide efficacy table for each of the crops. And the efficacy table for the wheat section does break down a lot of this information in detail by weed species.
Chemical Weed Control Guide can be obtained through your local extension office, or you can go to the online bookstore out of K-State Research and Extension. That's bookstore.ksre.ksu.edu. If one needs a refresher on the growth stages of wheat, there is a resource one can turn to from Extension as well, Sarah.
Yeah, so we have really great resources for growth staging all of our crops, but the one that we're interested today is a growth stage chart for wheat that Romulo Lovato has put together and that folks can find on the Extension bookstore as a download, or they can order a big, like wall-sized, really nice copy.
That also to be found at ksre.ksu.edu/bookstore. Sarah, thank you so much for going over this with us. Very important and timely subject for our wheat producers to consider.
Thanks, Eric.
Sarah Lancaster with us, Weed Management Specialist, K-State Research and Extension. 2 sources of reference for you on this. There's an article on growth stage of wheat and herbicide decisions aligned with that growth stage in the Agronomy E-Update newsletter posted on Thursday, the 10th of March at agronomy.ksu.edu. We'd also encourage you to regularly take in the podcast that Sarah contributes to, War Against Weeds. She and her peers from other universities weigh in on contemporary topics in crop weed control. Simply search for War Against Weeds, and you'll find that. And we'll be back with more. You're listening to Agriculture Today. You're listening to Agriculture Today, and welcome back. Dynamic things happening, of course, in the grain markets, so much stemming back to Ukraine, which we'll talk about today as we visit once more with Guy Allen from the IGP Institute here at Kansas State University, where he serves as the senior economist. He joins us monthly to look at what's happening in international grain sales and where the U.S. is positioned in that. But the centerpiece this time would be the wheat market, and a lot of that does draw from, Guy, what's happening in Ukraine. The two parties involved in that conflict, Ukraine and Russia, are large players in the wheat trade internationally.
Yeah, they're fairly significant players, particularly in the international exports. They make up just under 30% of global export supplies. And what we're seeing over the last 10 days, 2 weeks, is the market trying to figure out and adjust to how that international trade is going to be impacted and how those grain flows are going to change, assuming supplies are not available out of the Black Sea now. And that includes not only Russia and the Ukraine, but the whole shipping out of the Black Sea has effectively been shut down. And we're starting to see those impacts sort of filter through the marketplace already. We're seeing some of that business come to the U.S. as well as other markets.
The status report there, you say that Russia exports of wheat are now next to nil, and of course Ukraine is embroiled in the war on its own native soil, so nothing's really happening there, is it?
Yeah, pretty quiet. Yeah, basically the Black Sea exports by water have been shut down, particularly for the Ukraine. I think there's still some wheat exports moving out of Russia into Turkey and some of the adjacent countries, into Iran, etc. Most of that moves overland, not a huge amount, but it is an important access to grain in that area. The other thing we're seeing, though, is both Russia and the Ukraine starting to shut down exports. And I think a real concern they have is twofold. One is the immediate inflationary prices on the cost of food in those countries is a concern. So if you shut off your exports, it depresses your domestic prices. And I think there's also some long-term thinking in there. There's some real concern about the planting of this spring's crop and the condition and yield of that wheat, even though 80% of it's winter wheat. It's been planted. I don't think it's going to get fertilized. So what's next season's production going to be? And will they need increased carryover stocks next marketing year? And the last thing you want to happen in that area is to run out of your wheat and food grain supplies.
Mm-hmm. As we think about and stay with for a moment Russia, Ukraine, even if a peace accord is struck immediately here and ceasefire is declared, it'll be a while before either of those countries is back up to speed in its normal wheat trading?
Yeah, talking to my connections in that area, you've got to remember about 12% or more of the population has actually left the country and fled to other places. Most of your remaining men of able-bodied and military-serving age are currently busy at the moment defending the country. They're not really focused on their day jobs, so to speak. The best source sort of I had indicated in the cessation of hostilities, it would be 60 to 90 days before commerce actually started to get back into place, and that takes a bit of time to start that back up. Even if it does get back up, we're quite concerned on the capacity of the supply chain. Some warehouses have been damaged, some burned, damages to the rail lines and damages to bridges to move that grain then to port. And there has been some damage at the port, but not a lot. But you still have to move that grain from up country to port location to get it in an exportable position.
Well, all eyes are on what's happening in that region, but there are other obvious players in the wheat game internationally. Australia, you note, and you're familiar infinitely with that country, is looking at an abundant wheat crop coming on. Yeah,
this past week, USDA raised the wheat production estimate by 2 million tons to 778.5 million metric tons, mainly on the back of an increase in Australia. They're having a second year of record crop. Their biggest challenge is getting that crop out of the country. Their supply chain capacity, port capacity, is effectively booked out till new crop next year. And looking at their current planting situation, which they're coming up on this month and next, they'll commence planting this next year's crop. They've got good moisture, probably too much moisture in some areas at the moment, but in Australia, rain makes grain. And I wouldn't be surprised Australia this coming season have another very large crop there as well. Their ending stocks are actually going to increase this year because they just can't get it out of the country fast enough. And that's not only wheat, but it's also barley, it's also canola and a few other commodities. And it's a lot of the same commodities that we see exported out of the Ukraine and Russia. But they're sort of substituting in that as well.
And you say India is of interest here as far as its wheat trade.
Yes, India's had a couple years of good wheat crops, and they've actually, from time to time, there'll be a wheat importer or a wheat exporter. At the moment, they're expected to export a record 10 million tons of wheat. So that's kind of helping the situation there in that adjacent to that Black Sea area and filling some of that demand with their wheat exports. That said, a number of those countries, not only Russia and the Ukraine, concerned about maintaining domestic supply. India, Argentina, and increasingly a number of countries with these higher commodity prices are concerned about domestic food inflation, and if they're importing, securing their supply chains and their supplies going forward. And that's going to make for a very interesting dynamic and situation in global trade as we move forward.
Yeah. Guy, even before Russia invaded Ukraine, wheat stocks globally were tight.
Well, they were tightening. The last 2 years we've seen exceptionally tight, historically tight corn and soybeans, and wheat had sort of been the loosest of the balance sheets. But in the last year we tightened that up a bit, I think from 40 down to 30%. And I think with this Ukrainian situation, I think next year, and my longer-term concern and a greater concern is actually what we're going to see for the next marketing year if those summer crops don't get planted. And even more globally, we need above trend line production around the world to replenish all of the stocks, whether they're corn, barley, grain, sorghum, oilseeds, and now as well as wheat to replenish those global stocks. And it's just a very difficult situation to expect that.
And to that, some thoughts that you've put together in this month's notes on the grain trades. On the coarse grain scene, looking at Russia and Ukraine once more, Ukraine is a corn producer, but obviously exports are hung up there.
Yeah, probably even more so than wheat. I think wheat, they've exported about 2/3 of their expected program. The balance of that I don't think will get out. I'm probably a bit more pessimistic than USDA for corn. USDA had their exports at about 33 to 34 million metric tons, and they only have about 17 of that complete. That leaves a balance of about 16, and I just don't think that's going to get out. So that's going to leave a pretty big hole in that corn market, and that's probably where we're seeing that business come to the U.S. already to supply that corn. And that corn global balance sheet's pretty tight, and that's one reason we're looking very, very closely at that Brazilian crop and that South American crop on how that develops, because that's going to be the first to come to market before our crop comes to market here next year. But corn, we're running very, very, very tight.
And on the oilseed side, again, the two countries in question here, not major players in soybeans, but alternately in other oilseed crops.
Yeah, they're particularly a large producer of sunflowers. They produce, the Ukraine, about 17.5 million metric tons of sunflowers, and Russia's about 15.5. Keep in mind, sunflowers, they're mainly processed in those two countries, and then they export the oil. They're higher oil seeds, about 36-38%. It's that soybean oil or the vegetable oil price that has been driving a lot of these oil seeds higher, and it's going to have a definite impact on that whole oil seeds complex as we move forward.
Right. Well, you say that given all of this, there is an important footnote on the local level in as far as shipping availability?
Well, the biggest question we've had lately from growers is, why is the basis so cheap? We've got very, very strong inverses. 10 days ago, we saw a dollar inverse between March, May, over a dollar inverse between May, July, good inverses between July, September. And the markets, what's the market telling us? It's telling us, I want that grain today. Particularly the export market is quite demanding of that. But you've got to be able to execute. If you can't execute today, well, you don't capture that higher price. If you're sitting in a rail house in Kansas, Nebraska, and you can't get rail equipment, it's just hard to capture that price. And if you look at the rail car market, rail cars are bid at over $1,000 premium per car. So the country elevator is very, very worried about being able to execute. A lot of them have moved to bidding off the July new crop for wheat, and even moving their bids forward for some of the other commodities as well. But that inverse structure is prevalent all the way through the pricing structure for corn, beans, and wheat, and that makes it very, very hard to merchandise because it's all happening right now. They won't need to ship it quickly.
Guy does post regular notes on the international grain trades and how those resonate at our local markets likewise on agmanager.info, and we would invite you to use that as a resource of information, agmanager.info. Guy, always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's Guy Allen. He's the senior economist with the IGP Institute here at K-State. We'll be back on Agriculture Today. Welcome back to Agriculture Today, and for this week's horticulture segment, we continue a conversation begun last week with K-State horticulturist Ward Upham. It is garden potato planting time, and Ward talked with us earlier about selecting garden potatoes for planting and some preparatory steps to take before actually seeding those. But we got to the point, Ward, of splitting those potato seed pieces up, but allow them to cure. And then it's time to place those seed pieces, digging the row, planting them how deep?
Really only 1 to 2 inches deep is all you want to plant them, because that will allow you to be put into soil that's relatively warm and will decrease the amount of time it takes for them to come up, because it does take them a while to come up. And then between the seed pieces, 8 to 12 inches. So if you want to push it, you want to get the most potatoes from the smallest space, then 8 inches. If you've got more space, then 12 inches would be fine.
How long does one need to wait before they see evidence of their work? How slow is emergence here?
They're slow. They can be really slow. And so even if you plant in mid-March, it may easily be mid-April before they come up. So don't be too concerned if you don't see them come up right away. That's normal for these. Even if they do come up and you get a cold snap that burns off the top of that growth, don't dig them up and replant. There are other eyes on those seed pieces that will take the place of the one that got burned down. And so don't worry if they come up early and you get a late cold snap, they're going to be fine.
Exercise patience there. And once emergence occurs, one needs to create a good growing environment for those new seedlings. Talk about that, if you would.
So when those new potatoes are formed, they're formed on top of that seed piece. And therefore, they often will erupt right out of the ground. And you have to be careful about that because if sunlight hits those new potatoes, they'll produce a product known as solanine that's green. And that can be poisonous. It won't kill you, but it can make you sick. And so as those potatoes grow and those new potatoes are formed, actually heal the soil up around both sides of that row so that you cover them, so that sunlight doesn't hit them. It also makes it a lot easier, doing it this way makes it a lot easier to dig them because they're shallow and they're easy to dig up. So just make sure no sunlight hits those. Even if they do, even if you get sunlight hits them, all you have to do is put those in a dark place for a week or so, and the green will go away and they'll be fine to eat. Okay, so don't throw them away if that happens. Just put them in a dark place.
But monitor what's happening there and mound that soil accordingly.
Yes.
We're way ahead of this, but when should one harvest garden potatoes? Maybe, again, exercising patience here.
That's right. Usually when those vines are about half dead, usually that's going to be July. It's going to be July. Now, if you want to get new potatoes, and a lot of people like to mix peas and potatoes, just dig them early. That's fine. Doesn't hurt anything. It's just that you're not going to get the pounds of production you'll get if you allowed them to mature.
As we're talking about that, looking forward, once one digs their garden potatoes, they need to rest a bit before going into storage.
That's right. When you first dig them, they need to, if there are any wounds on them, they need to heal over. So just put them in a shady, dry location for a day or so. And that'll allow any cut surfaces to, again, suberize over. They're going to be fine. And then you put them into a cool, moist environment, such as a cellar or a cool basement, in order to store them. You don't refrigerate them. If you refrigerate them, some of that starch is turned to sugar, and they're not going to taste the way you think they should. Again, if that happens, you just put them back at room temperature for maybe a week or so, and that sugar is converted back to starch. So it's not something you throw them away. You just have to correct it.
So tuck those latter 2 points away for later on, presuming that you have succeeded with your potato planting. Ward, thank you for the advice on getting this crop out of the ground in good shape.
You bet.
Ward Upham on potato planting here in the spring for your home gardening enjoyment. He is a horticulturist with K-State Research and Extension. And that caps off our Thursday edition. Thanks once more to you for tuning in, and please be back with us right here this same time tomorrow. Until then, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.